Elena Kruger stepped onto the academy's courtyard with the muted weight of someone who had traveled far and left pieces of herself behind along the way. Her uniform was clean but worn at the seams, pressed neatly but not new, a field coat that still held the faint smell of dust and smoke. Across her chest glinted a row of medals, not excessive, not gaudy, but too many for someone her age. They caught the morning light like small sparks, and that was enough to draw eyes. Heads turned. Whispers began. She kept walking, boots steady on the pavement, until she reached her spot in formation. The courtyard was lined with recruits and junior officers, their postures stiff, their chatter quick and sharp. The first laugh came soft, a hiss carried on the wind. "Where'd she buy those?" "eBay," someone muttered, and a ripple of chuckles followed. A tall lieutenant with polished boots and the kind of arrogance only connections could buy stepped out of line just enough to let his voice carry. "Medals that shiny don't belong to someone that quiet," he sneered, his grin cutting like a blade. "You sure you're in the right place, Kruger? Maybe the parade ground, not here." Eyes flicked toward her, waiting for her to falter, to break formation, to fire back, but Elena didn't move. She stood as though rooted, her hazel eyes locked straight ahead, not a flicker in her face. Inside, the silence burned like hot coal pressed against her chest, but outside she was stone. The sergeant barked the next command, and the recruits shifted into drills. Elena moved with the same precision she always had, but the whispers followed her like shadows. By mid-morning, the first accident happened. A female recruit with manicured nails brushed past her in the locker area, fingers grazing Elena's chest just enough to dislodge a medal. It clattered to the ground, the sound loud against the tile. "Oh, sorry," the recruit said, too sweet, too fake. She bent down, picked it up with two fingers like it was dirty, and held it high for the others to see. "What's this? A souvenir soldier?" The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting. Elena didn't reach for it. She waited, let the laughter run its course, then took the medal back with steady hands. She pinned it again, aligning it with the others, her fingers precise. She didn't look at them, didn't give them the satisfaction. Later, during equipment checks, another medal slipped loose again, this time knocked off by a deliberate elbow. A low chuckle rose from the back. "Careful, Kruger. Wouldn't want your collection falling apart. Bet the ribbons aren't even real silk." The sound of ridicule cut through the courtyard like static, but Elena only crouched, picked it up, and pinned it again. Her fingers lingered on the medal a fraction longer than necessary. Not hesitation, just control. She drew in a breath, slow and even, as if anchoring herself to something invisible. By afternoon drills, the whispers had turned into open snickers. Some recruits mimicked her walk, others pointed at her chest when instructors weren't looking. Yet when the line reformed, Elena stood exactly as she had that morning, tall, unflinching, her silence like a wall they couldn't climb. The burn inside hadn't gone away. If anything, it grew heavier with each sneer, each laugh, but she carried it differently. Not as weight pressing her down, but as something she balanced, something she could turn into steel when the time came. Her eyes stayed fixed forward, calm but alive, and anyone paying close attention would have noticed it, the quiet promise of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. No one noticed, not yet. The sun rose hot and unrelenting over the academy grounds, the kind of heat that turned asphalt into a shimmering haze and pressed the air heavy into every breath. Boots lined the start of the endurance march, packs cinched tight, rifles slung across shoulders. 20 kilometers stretched ahead through dust, gravel, and broken terrain. Instructors barked orders, their voices clipped and sharp, and the recruits shuffled into place. Elena Kruger stood at the end of the row, her uniform already clinging to her skin, her medals tucked neatly into place despite the sweat forming on her collar. She adjusted her pack without a word, her expression unreadable. Around her, smirks flashed like knives. Lieutenant Cole, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of arrogance that came from being born into privilege, caught her eye and let a slow grin spread across his face. Hope those shiny medals don't weigh you down, Kruger, he said, loud enough for the line to hear. A few chuckles followed. The whistle blew, and the line lurched forward. Dust rose quickly, boots pounding into the trail. The first stretch was easy, adrenaline carrying them through, chatter spilling between gasps of breath. Cole surged ahead, arms pumping, calling over his shoulder. Try to keep up, souvenir soldier. His voice carried, smug, even as his pace pushed sweat down his temples. By kilometer 5, the jokes thinned. Packs grew heavier, straps cut into shoulders, and the rhythm of boots slowed. Heat shimmered across the open ground, and breaths grew ragged. Elena didn't chase the front. She moved steady, her pace unbroken, eyes fixed on the path. Blisters burned raw on her heels, but her stride never faltered. She didn't stop for water. Didn't bend under the weight of the gear. Her silence was its own march. By kilometer 12, Cole's grin had twisted into a grimace. His shirt clung dark with sweat, his steps uneven. He slowed, then stumbled, muttering curses under his breath as Elena passed him without a glance. Others faltered too. One recruit dropped to his knees, clutching at his side. Another staggered until an instructor hauled him out. Elena kept moving, steady, precise, her breaths even as though the trail belonged to her. When the march ended, she stood at the finish line, shoulders straight, pack still on her back. The clock showed her time faster than most of the men who had mocked her. She didn't celebrate. She simply unbuckled her straps, set her pack down neatly, and waited. The trials continued into the range. Rifles cracked in the dry air, targets flipping down one after another. Shots scattered wide for many of the recruits, frustration cutting through the noise. Cole fired fast, bullets slapping dirt and dust with poor aim. Elena's shots came slow, deliberate. Each trigger pull echoed like punctuation. When the smoke cleared, her grouping was tight, nearly perfect. She laid the rifle down with care, adjusted her medals, and walked off the line in silence. Navigation drills followed in swamped terrain, the air heavy with the stink of mud and stagnant water. Compasses spun in untrained hands, maps soaked with sweat and damp. Recruits cursed as they missed checkpoints, stumbling through reeds and muck. Elena traced her course without pause. Her compass never wavered, her map work precise. She moved through the swamp like she had been there before, her boots sinking but her eyes clear, her pace unfaltering. When she reached the final checkpoint, the instructor scribbled something on his board, his eyes narrowing in thought. But silence did not buy her peace. That evening, in the mess hall, Cole found her again. His grin was back, though weaker now, stretched over the strain of his exhaustion. He dropped onto the bench across from her, his tray clattering against the table. "You know," he said, his voice pitched for those nearby. "I Googled your unit. Guess what I found? Nothing. No record. No mention. It's like it never existed." He leaned in, smirking. "Which means either you're a liar or you've been telling fairy tales and pinning souvenirs to your chest." A few recruits snickered, their eyes darting between them. Elena didn't lift her head. She finished her meal slowly, her fork scraping quiet against the tray. She gave no answer, no defense, not even a glance. When she stood, she left her tray neatly stacked, her medals catching the dull fluorescent light as she walked out. Later that night, while the compound quieted, Elena was on the training field alone. The moon cut silver against the sky, and her breath clouded in the cool air. She ran the obstacle course again and again, her boots pounding dirt, her hands gripping ropes until calluses split. Each medal pinned to her chest caught a flicker of moonlight as she moved, like steel secrets gleaming against the dark. She never spoke, never shouted, never sought witness. But every step, every motion carried the weight of someone who didn't need recognition to prove truth. The silence was hers, and she wielded it like a blade. The days at the academy stretched long, stitched together by sweat, drills, and the unspoken hierarchy that punished anyone who stood out. Elena Kruger still walked with the same steady silence, her medals pinned to her chest, her gaze fixed straight ahead. To most, she remained a mystery to mock, a target that invited smirks and whispered jokes, but not everyone saw her the same way. Senior Master Sergeant Alvarez had been in long enough to know the difference between luck and muscle memory. He noticed it first during the weapons malfunction drill. Recruits fumbled with jammed rifles, swearing under their breath as they slapped magazines, overcorrected, and wasted seconds. Elena's rifle locked up, and her hands moved in a blur tap, rack, ready. The motion was clean, unconscious. The kind of speed that came only from 1,000 repetitions in places where hesitation cost lives. She didn't look around to see who noticed. She didn't grandstand. She just slung the weapon and moved on. Later, in terrain navigation, the swamp water clung heavy to boots and uniforms, maps blurred by damp air and careless hands. Elena's compass stayed steady. Her pencil lines across the map cut precise, like someone etching coordinates into memory. Alvarez watched from a distance, his weathered eyes narrowing. Too smooth, he thought. Too exact for someone who didn't belong. That evening, long after taps, when most recruits had collapsed into bunks, Alvarez sat alone in the records room. The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he typed into the secure archive system. He told himself it was just curiosity, just due diligence. He searched her name, Kruger, Elena. The official academy file was sparse basic data, enlistment details, training assignments. Too clean, too light. His fingers tapped another path, deep into restricted folders most staff ignored. Buried in the archives, he found it a redacted dossier. Black lines cut across most of the text, but the fragments that remained were enough to make his chest tighten. Operation names struck through, dates blurred, but there, in grainy sepia-tinted photographs, stood Elena. Desert fatigues, dirt smeared across her face, her stance calm amid chaos. She wasn't alone. Around her stood a unit that had no official designation, only a codename, Obsidian. A name Alvarez had heard once, whispered in corridors years ago, dismissed as rumor. He leaned closer. On Elena's chest, faint but visible in the photo, was a medal, not the common ribbons handed out for routine service. This one was different. A winged insignia etched with detail too fine for a counterfeit, too secret to be displayed casually. Alvarez glanced back to memory. He had seen it pinned to her uniform days earlier. No civilian store, no novelty shop could have made it. It was real. The next morning, under a pale sky, combat simulations roared across the training field. Recruits paired off in mock skirmishes, dirt flying as blanks rattled. Elena moved through cover and concealment with precision, every crouch, every pivot instinctive. She wasn't just practicing, she was remembering. Alvarez watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Cole, as always, couldn't resist the chance to perform. He caught her between drills, voice loud and mocking. "Careful with that trigger, Kruger. Wouldn't want you to chip your pretty medals. Might ruin the collection." Laughter followed, brittle and sharp. Elena didn't flinch. She simply reset her stance, reloaded with smooth efficiency, and dropped into the next maneuver without a word. Alvarez didn't step in. He didn't silence Cole. Instead, he pulled out his clipboard, the edges bent and stained from years in the field. He wrote her name slowly, carefully, and then circled it once. He paused, then circled it again, his pen digging into the paper. The laughter around her faded into the background. Alvarez knew what he'd seen, what the files had shown. The truth was there, buried under redactions and shadows. Elena Kruger wasn't a fraud. She was something far more dangerous, proof that legends walked quietly, waiting for the world to notice. The morning of graduation broke clear and sharp, the kind of sky that seemed too bright for the weight of everything it covered. Rows of recruits stood assembled in the courtyard, uniforms pressed, boots polished until they caught the Sunday. The air carried a mix of nerves and forced pride, but beneath it all ran the low hum of whispers. Elena Kruger stood at the far edge of the formation, her medals pinned neat across her chest, catching the light like fragments of fire. The murmurs followed her as they always had, fake, forged. Bought from a pawnshop, laughter had faded over the months, but the disbelief lingered, passed from one set of lips to another, like smoke refusing to clear. She didn't answer them. She hadn't from the start. Her silence was her shield, her stance unbroken. She watched the commander step onto the podium, papers in hand, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he began the roll of names. Applause punctuated each diploma, hands clapping in orderly rhythm. Elena's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, her breath steady, her medals unmoved. Then the sound came a low rumble, engines heavy and unmistakable. Heads turned in unison. A black motorcade rolled through the gates, tires crunching gravel, flags snapping in the breeze. The courtyard fell silent as the vehicles slowed to a stop. Doors opened, and from the center car stepped the President of the United States. No warning, no announcement, just presence. The air shifted. Cadets stiffened. The commander froze mid-sentence, and every eye followed the president as he crossed the courtyard. His gaze moved over the rows, scanning faces, uniforms, bearing. But he didn't pause at the front. He didn't linger on the polished golden boys who had strutted and sneered for months. He kept walking, steady and sure, until he reached the edge of the formation, until he stood before Elena Kruger. For a breath, time held still. Then the president straightened, his hand rising in a salute sharp and deliberate, his voice carrying so that no one could mistake his words. "Major Elena Kruger," he said, his tone ringing like steel against stone. "Your service saved not just lives, but nations. These medals are real, and so is she." The words cracked across the courtyard like thunder. Gasps rippled through the formation. Some recruits flinched as though struck. Others lowered their eyes to the ground, their faces pale. Cole, who had spent every chance mocking her, looked hollow, his jaw slack, the color drained from his skin. His hands, once so quick to point and sneer, hung useless at his sides. Elena did not move at first. She let the silence wash over her, let the truth settle into the bones of everyone present. Then she lifted her hand, slow and steady, and returned the salute with the same precision that had carried her through every insult, every trial. She did not smile. She did not gloat. Her eyes stayed calm, her face unreadable. The president dropped his salute, gave her a single nod, and stepped back toward his motorcade. The commander stood frozen, the diploma list forgotten in his hands. The courtyard remained hushed, the silence heavy now not with mockery but with shame. Elena lowered her hand and let it rest again at her side. She stood exactly as she had before, but everything had changed. Her silence had spoken louder than any defense she could have offered. It had waited, endured, and in that single salute, it had been heard. And for the first time since she had walked into that courtyard, no one dared to laugh.